For those of us lucky enough to live in stable modern states, we tend not to think about the problem of legitimacy. The leader of a country is by default legitimate. In democracies, legitimacy comes from the results of free and fair elections. In monarchies, it comes from well-established patterns of inheritance. But for those living in failed states, legitimacy often comes from naked military force. It is the rare revolution that quickly establishes its own legitimacy and shores up its right to govern. More often than not, revolution breeds counter-revolution, especially in those states where governmental institutions are weak, or in those where the path to legitimacy was too narrow. Take, for example, the government of pre-revolutionary France. That government was an absolute monarchy, whereby all the powers of the state were invested in one man. In such a system, there is no institution that can step in to take over the daily business of government in the absence of the absolute monarch. Once he's gone, say deposed in a revolution, it is not at all clear who is in charge. In the absence of this clarity, separate and competing power centers naturally begin to develop, each one striving against all the others for potential recognition as the new and legitimate governmental force. It should come as no surprise then that Maximinus Thrax was faced with not just one challenge to his reign, but multiple. The elevation of an unwilling civil servant as a result of a local dispute over taxation was never going to be seen as legitimate by everyone in the vast and politically complex Roman Empire. But the Rome of the early 3rd century was not like pre-revolutionary France. The vestiges of the old republican system that defined the Roman government for the first several centuries of its history were still alive and well, if not severely weakened inside of the Principate created by Augustus. While neither the Senate nor the consuls were in command of powerful armies anymore, senators still met to discuss business, and lower-ranked politicians still sought election to high office in the Senate. Even in its weakened imperial form, every once in a while, decisions of the Senate had great impact on the Roman state. For example, in 96 AD, the Emperor Domitian was assassinated as a result of a conspiracy of his household staff. As emperor, Domitian had little patience for the established custom of imperial respect towards the Senate. While the office of emperor might have been a de facto kingship, most of the emperors up until Domitian were willing to defer some power and decision-making to the Senate, not only to help maintain the illusion of an uninterrupted civil authority that was both very ancient and very Roman, but also to help alleviate some of the responsibilities that came with the office of emperor. Domitian, however, had no patience for this. He demanded that the senators of his own day refer to him as Lord and God, the kind of address expected from a slave to a master. His hatred of the Senate and the aristocracy in general culminated in a series of treason trials where the emperor killed upwards of 20 senators for little more than suspicion of disloyalty. For these reasons, when Domitian was assassinated, the first act of the Senate was to vote a damnatio memoriae for the former emperor. This amounted to a general prohibition on displaying the name or likeness of the emperor. In an Orwellian way, the name of the damned was chiseled off of public inscriptions, and statues were toppled. History itself was rewritten. Fortunately for us, the desire of the Romans to effectively erase an emperor from the archaeological and historical records vastly outstripped their capacity to actually do it. The next order of business was to find a suitable replacement for the emperor. Strictly speaking, the Senate always had the power to confirm the newly appointed emperor, as they had since the inception of the office. But this was the first time in Roman history that the Senate chose who the next emperor would actually be. You see, Domitian, having produced only one son who died in early childhood, was the last of the Flavian dynasty. With no clear path of succession, the Senate took it upon themselves to make the decision, a remarkable act for a body unused to decisive action independent of the emperor. It would appear that at least a few key members of the body knew about the plot to assassinate Domitian and had planned all along to elect one of their own number to the role of emperor. On the very same day the emperor's death was announced, the Senate went into session and elected Marcus Cocceius Nerva to the purple. The senators understood that their ancient college could serve as a deep source of legitimacy in the absence of any other credible source. They chose Nerva in part because he was older and had no children of his own. This meant that regardless of how his administration might go, the Senate was not locking in a decades-long reign with potential for hereditary advancement. They were electing a placeholder emperor and reasserting some of their old republican independence. While the Senate might have been happy with the choice, the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal legion of bodyguards, was not. They demanded that Nerva adopt a man of their choosing, someone with more military experience, to be his successor. That man was the future Emperor Trajan. This episode wouldn't be the only time that the Senate would attempt to control the succession process. A century later, upon the assassination of the Emperor Commodus, the Senate again would convene and elect one of their own to the highest office in the land. This man, Pertinax, was not so dissimilar from Nerva, having likewise reached old age after a lifetime of service at the highest levels of government. Unlike Nerva, however, Pertinax was not able to balance his election with the demands of the Praetorian Guard. While Pertinax was dismayed by how much money was spent on the Guard and by how powerful they had become, his decision to immediately attempt to reform them proved to be a fatal one. He would be assassinated by the Praetorians only 3 months after his election. When we last left off, Gordian I, the aged governor of Africa, had just been elevated to the office of emperor by a band of aristocratic young men who had themselves rebelled against their local procurator. If you'll remember, Gordian was less than thrilled by this turn of events. His first act of emperor was to elevate his adult son, also named Gordian, to the position of co-emperor. Just as in the case of the Senate electing its own members to be emperor, this practice of divided rule was well established by this point in Roman history. A century beforehand, Marcus Aurelius was elevated to the purple with a co-emperor, Lucius Verus. After him, during the Severan dynasty, Septimius Severus made his older son Caracalla his co-emperor. Even after Septimius Severus's death, Caracalla would serve with his younger brother Geta as co-emperor. If perhaps Gordian had been better prepared for his own elevation, or if he had more broad support in Africa, this could have been the start of a new dynasty. Gordian II, that is the elder Gordian's son, was still relatively young at about 46 years old. He in turn had a son, also named, you guessed it, Gordian. We tend to number the Gordians to avoid confusion, the eldest Gordian being Gordian I, the middle the second, and the youngest the third. At least locally, the Gordians seemed to have quite a bit of support. They were able to travel to the provincial capital of Carthage under a full imperial escort, using all the trappings and insignia of empire. Furthermore, when the elder Gordian wrote to the Senate, he found much support there. This is not surprising, as Gordian I had spent a long career in the imperial service and was friends with or related to many senators. But he would lose the support of even these men if he did not act carefully. To that end, Gordian promised everything to everyone. He assured the senators that those who Maximinus had exiled unfairly would be restored to their lands, and that there would be an end to treason trials and informers in their ranks under his administration. To the Praetorian Guard, he promised the largest donative yet in Roman history. There was only one thing the African emperor wanted in return. He sent the quaestor of the province of Africa along with a contingent of soldiers to Rome with sealed instructions to kill the Praetorian prefect, Vitalianus. Vitalianus was known for his allegiance to Maximinus, as well as for his cruelty in his capacity as the head of the Praetorian Guard. Gordian saw him as an existential threat to his attempt at legitimacy. As long as he was alive, he would strongly oppose Gordian at every turn, and use his considerable influence as Praetorian prefect to stop the Senate along with the rest of the aristocracy at Rome from recognizing him as emperor. Gordian's delegation appeared before Vitalianus in Rome just before dawn. Herodian tells us what happened next. It all happened precisely as Gordian had ordered. Since Vitalianus was accustomed to appear before daybreak, the messengers came to him privately while it was still dark and only a few people were with him. Some visitors had not yet arrived. Others had greeted him before dawn and had already left. All was quiet, with only a few people outside his door. When the messengers from Gordian revealed to the prefect what had been described above, they were readily admitted. Handing him the dispatches, they drew their daggers while he was examining the seals and stabbed him to death. Then, holding their daggers ready for action, they sprang from the house. Those who were present drew back in astonishment, thinking that Maximinus had ordered the murder, for he often did this sort of thing even to those who seemed to be his most intimate friends. Hurrying down the sacred way, the assassins displayed the letters of Gordian to the people and handed over his directives to the consuls and other officials. The rumor that Maximinus had been assassinated was spread far and wide by them. When word of this got around, the people of Rome reacted violently. They tore down the paintings of Maximinus's exploits that were posted in front of the Curia and overturned his statues. The mob viciously attacked anyone previously associated with Maximinus's reign. The Senate acted quickly. They confirmed the acclamation of Gordian I and II and revoked the title from Maximinus, declaring him a public enemy. Then they sent delegations to all the provincial governors bearing letters asking for unity and solidarity at a time of political crisis. Unfortunately for the Romans, none of the delegations could have possibly reached their destinations in time. While the two Gordians might have secured senatorial legitimacy in the capital, they were never able to successfully win over the legions of Africa. The provinces of Africa were lightly defended when compared to the northern and eastern frontiers of the empire. The bulk of the troops were stationed in Numidia to protect against Moorish raids. The governor of this province, a man named Capellianus, just so happened to be a supporter of Maximinus, either because he owed his position in Africa to the Thracian emperor, or because of his hatred of Gordian I, which supposedly stemmed from a grudge over a previous legal dispute between the two. Whatever the reason, this governor was the only man in Africa with a legion of soldiers directly under his control. Perhaps thinking that he might take the empire for himself, Capellianus ordered his troops to march against Carthage, and the Gordians taking shelter there. The emperors mounted what little defense they could, enlisting a mob of young supporters to defend them. Herodian describes the ensuing battle. When the report of this army's approach reached the city, Gordian was terrified. The Carthaginians, however, aroused by the news and thinking that their hope of victory lay in the size of the mob rather than in the military discipline of an army, went forth in a body to oppose Capellianus. The elder Gordian, some say, was in despair because Capellianus was attacking Carthage. When he considered the size of Maximinus's army and reflected that there were no forces in Africa strong enough to match it, he hanged himself. His death was kept secret, however, and his son was chosen to command the crowd of civilians. When the battle was joined, the Carthaginians were superior in numbers, but they were an undisciplined mob without military training, for they had grown up in a time of complete peace and indulged themselves constantly in feasts and festivals. To make it worse, they were without arms and proper equipment. Each man brought from home a dagger, an axe, or a hunting spear. Those who found hides cut out circles of leather, arranged pieces of wood as a frame, and fashioned shields as best they could. The Numidians, by contrast, were excellent javelin men and superb horsemen. Scorning a bridle, they used only a stick to guide their mounts. They easily routed the huge Carthaginian mob without waiting for the Numidians' charge. The Carthaginians threw down their arms and fled. Crowding and trampling one another underfoot, more Carthaginians were killed in the crush than fell by the enemy action. There the son of Gordian died, together with all his companions, and the number of dead was so great that it was impossible to gather them for burial. The body of the young Gordian was never found. So ended the reign of the Gordians. They were colleagues in empire for 22 glorious days. The sources disagree on when and how Gordian I hanged himself. The Historia Augusta tells the more compelling story, that upon hearing of the death of his son in battle, the elder Gordian was so overcome that he ended his life hanging himself with his own belt. Capellianus, for his part, continued to plunder the countryside of Africa after the battle. He gave his troops as many spoils and slaves as possible, so that if it ever came down to a fight between himself and Maximinus, he could have a credible attempt at the throne. We don't know whatever happened to Capellianus after these events. He is simply never mentioned in the sources again. When news of all of this reached the Senate, a deep sense of fear gripped the ancient body. Surely now, they were all marked for death by Maximinus, who, when he found out about their first act of treason in the elevation of Gordian I and II, swore to march on the capital. In fact, he was already on his way. marching from the frontier with the best troops the army had at its disposal. The senators convened not in the Curia, but in the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, that god that the Romans revered over all others. They sealed themselves in the shrine and resolved to elect 2 new emperors from their number. While there wouldn't be any white smoke to signify their decision, one can see in this action a foreshadowing of how the College of Cardinals in the Roman Catholic Church select a new pope by popular vote while sealed in a religious building. The senators chose 2 men for their age and vast experience, Marcus Claudius Pupienus Maximus and Decimus Caelius Calvinus Balbinus. We know them as Pupienus and Balbinus for short. When news of the Senate's decision got out, the people of Rome were not impressed. Pupienus, who had previously served as prefect of the city of Rome, was intensely disliked by certain criminal segments of Roman society, since he discharged his duties faithfully and honestly. Apparently, this was deemed too strict by the mob. They marched on the capital, all the while demanding that a man of the Gordian house should be made emperor, and that the mob would soon kill the 2 new Augusti minted by the Senate if they were ignored. The senators, still fearing for their own safety, obliged the crowd. As it turned out, the young grandson of Gordian I had come to Rome as part of the delegation sent by his grandfather. Surely, the safest thing to do was to place the fate of the empire in the hands of a 13-year-old boy. And so, the first act of the 2 new emperors was to elevate Gordian III as their junior colleague, and thereby appease the mob. Now there were 3 in the imperial college. They would have to act quickly and decisively if they were to survive Maximinus's planned invasion of Italy. I hope you've enjoyed this most recent trip to the late 230s AD. Let's all thank the immortal gods that, as turbulent as our own times can be, things are not nearly as bad now as they were then. If you like videos like this one, please consider liking and subscribing. I'm Matt Lupu. Thanks for listening.